You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, and Scene of the Crime. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac speaking. In this episode, we'll examine some of the movies, TV shows, comics, books, and theater shows that may have shaped the Zodiac killer communications, and whether those influences were genuine interest of the killer, or were specifically chosen as a widespread form of misdirection. We'll also examine the origin of the Zodiac pseudonym that first appeared in the August 4th, 1969 communication, which seemed to negate the notion of his identity being present in the 408 cipher. Let's travel chronologically through some of the communications and attempt to pinpoint the inspiration behind the design of each correspondence, starting with the 408 cipher, delivered in 3 parts to the San Francisco Chronicle, San Francisco Examiner, and Vallejo Times-Herald. When decoded, the 408 cipher contained the phrase, "the most dangerous animal," believed to have been influenced by the short story, The Most Dangerous Game, by Richard Connell, first published on January 19, 1924, or The Most Dangerous Game movie, adapted for screenplay in the 1932 version, starring Joel McCrea and Leslie Banks. It told the story of a man called General Zaroff, who lived on Ship Trap Island, where he passed away the time by rescuing shipwrecked sailors, who had the misfortune to trust his generosity, before equipping them with clothes, a hunting knife, and food, before releasing them with a 3-hour head start, promising to hunt them down like animals and kill them. If they were creative enough to survive the challenge of evading his clutches for 3 days, he would grant them their freedom. General Zaroff had grown tired of hunting wild animals, and decided that humans were a far more challenging proposition. The 408 cipher would mirror this sentiment by stating, "I like killing people, because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest." Rattle, a poster on the Zodiac Killer Facts Forum, noted that in the 1961 TV series Alfred Hitchcock Presents, the episode titled Museum Piece detailed the story of a young man attempting to track down a mischievous fox in his neighborhood. His aid for killing the fox at night was narrated in the TV show by his father, and his weaponry was described as a spotlight mounted on his .22, in such a way that his shot would strike the exact center of light. Events would transpire that caused him to shoot another young man for which he was jailed. His father appealed to the district attorney, who declined to help. Shortly afterwards, the district attorney was killed and a manhunt ensued, described by the father, who recalled, quote, "I remember the excitement of the manhunt, the most dangerous game." The father had fairly accurately described the content of the Zodiac Killer's 408 cipher mailed on July 31st, 1969, and the debut of Zodiac letter received by the San Francisco Examiner just 4 days later.
54 days later, the Zodiac Killer would go into full theatrical mode, dressing up in an executioner's hood and waistline bib, adorned with the Zodiac crosshairs, when he attacked both Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard on September the 27th, 1969, by the shoreline of Lake Berryessa. It would later be speculated by some Zodiac researchers he was influenced by Coco, the Lord High Executioner from the Gilbert and Sullivan comedic opera, The Mikado, because of his propensity to plagiarize librettos from several acts of the musical in the Little List letter on July the 26th, 1970, and the Exorcist letter on January the 29th, 1974. The Zodiac Killer would even use the phrase peekaboo on the Halloween card. In 1988, Jack the Ripper terrorized the Whitechapel district of London. In the same year, of somewhat less significance, Ed J. Smith wrote a stage parody called The Capitalist, or the City of Fort Worth, designed to encourage capital investment in Fort Worth, Texas, and underwritten by local banks and railroad lines. The two-act piece featured characters named Yankee Doodle, Cocoa Nut, By Gum, and Peekaboo. The Zodiac Killer was thought to have written his version of the Mikado based on recitals by Groucho Marx, who was a lifelong fan of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas, appearing as Coco in the production of the Mikado on NBC's Bell Telephone Hour in 1960. He also recited Titwillow in 1960 and on the Dick Cavett Show on March the 20th, 1970. Groucho Marx was also believed to have been depicted on the contested Eureka card mailed in December of 1990. Based on the location and time the Zodiac Killer entered the taxicab of Paul Stine on October the 11th, 1969, in the vicinity of the theatre district of San Francisco, people have pondered whether the Zodiac Killer had paid a visit to one of the local theatres or cinemas before entering the taxicab. Playing at the North Point Theatre on October the 11th, 1969, located at 2290 Powell Street, was the movie Midnight Cowboy, starring a young Dustin Hoffman, who ironically in one sequence of the movie got into an altercation with a yellow taxicab driver at a street intersection. The North Point Theatre would later showcase the controversial movie The Exorcist that featured heavily in the Zodiac Killer communication mailed on January the 29th, 1974, when he stated that the William Friedkin film was, quote, the best satirical comedy that I have ever seen.
11 days after the Zodiac's 408 cipher, on August 10, 1969, somebody mailed a card and a piece of paper to Sergeant John Lynch of the Vallejo Police Department, offering a viable key to the 408 cipher, but added, Dear Sergeant Lynch, I hope the enclosed key will prove to be beneficial to you in connection with the cipher letter writer. Working puzzles and cryptograms and word puzzles is one of my pleasures. Please forgive the absence of my signature or name, as I do not wish to have my name in the papers, and it could be mentioned by a slip of the tongue. With best wishes, Concerned Citizen. There's a strong argument to be had connecting this communication to the hand of the Zodiac Killer. As we would later find out with the arrival of the 340 cipher, Mount Diablo code, Halloween card, and Pine cards to name a few, the Zodiac Killer was fond of cryptic messages, codes, and ciphers. In fact, there are FBI files detailing 2 slips of paper found at a Marine Amphibious Force base on November 19, 1969, equating the Riddler, who was the arch nemesis of Batman, with the Zodiac Killer. One note stated, Dear Gunny Kramer, this is the Zodiac speaking, while the other opened with Dear Jum, here I am again, before signing off with the Zodiac and the Riddler. Dave Aranchak, author and moderator of the Zodiac Killer Ciphers website, produced an excellent YouTube video called Zodiac and Batman, and he gave numerous examples of suggested parallels between the Zodiac Killer communications and the Batman character, including the villain Dr. Zodiac, making astrological forecasts of doom while sending taunting letters to law enforcement. The character, Dr. Zodiac, was also featured in the 1939 movie Charlie Chan at Treasure Island, set in San Francisco. Whether any of these characters inspired the real Zodiac, consciously or subconsciously, to adopt his pseudonym, Zodiac, is virtually impossible to determine without asking the killer himself. Contemporary to the Zodiac was the Stargazer horoscope column by Clay R. Paulin, which would appear in over 400 newspapers, including the Vallejo Times-Herald in 1969. This column blended number puzzles and your Zodiac birth sign to reveal hidden messages personal to you. Did the Cipher Slayer become the Zodiac Killer by reading his horoscope between July 31st, 1969 and August 4th, 1969?
In 2013, Tahoe 27 discovered an extremely promising link between the design of Zodiac's Halloween card, mailed on October the 27th, 1970, to issue 30 of the Western Tim Holt comic book collection, featuring a death wheel, Lady Doom, and Red Mask. This feature of the comic is based upon the Rota Fortunae in medieval and ancient philosophy, where a wheel of fortune is spun to determine the fate of an individual. The origin of the Rota Fortunae is based upon the zodiac and the celestial spheres, so may have been specifically selected by the Zodiac Killer through a knowledge of this concept. The Wheel of Death featured on the front cover of this comic carried the same 4 methods of death to the ones depicted by the Zodiac Killer on October the 27th, 1970. The 4 methods of death were by knife, by gun, by fire, and by rope. The Zodiac Killer would use the word doomed as a possible extension to Lady Doom in the comic, and place a mask over the eyes of the skeleton on the inner card to maybe insinuate a connection to Red Mask. Although not everybody is on board with this comic being the definitive link to the Halloween card, the vast majority of Zodiac sleuths believe this comic book issue was the inspiration behind the Zodiac Killer's Halloween card. The March the 13th, 1971 Los Angeles letter stated, quote, "This is the Zodiac speaking. Like I have always said, I am crack-proof. If the Blue Meanies are ever going to catch me, they had better get off their fat asses and do something, because the longer they fiddle and fart around, the more slaves I will collect for my afterlife. I do have to give them credit for stumbling across my Riverside activity, but they are only finding the easy ones. There are a hell of a lot more down there. The reason I am writing to the Times is this: they don't bury me on the back pages like some of the others." But what was the inspiration for the wording in this letter? Vanishing Point was a film released in 1971, so bearing in mind the propensity of certain Zodiac communications to reference movies, in particular the 1974 letters, what relationship does this film have to the Los Angeles letter? The main character in the movie, Kowalski, is delivering a supercharged 1970 Dodge Challenger from Colorado to San Francisco, drawing the attention of police who attempt to stop him for speeding. This is some of the wording from the movie's January trailer. Quote, "They want to get him and put him away, but they'll have to catch him first." With a radio host from KOW reporting the chase and stating, "And there goes the Challenger, being chased by the Blue Meanies on wheels." The Zodiac Killer wrote, "If the Blue Meanies are ever going to catch me, they had better get off their fat asses and do something." This ordinarily may not be that compelling until you discover that the release date of the film Vanishing Point was March the 13th, 1971, the exact postmark date of the Zodiac Killer's Los Angeles letter. Curiously, the final scene in the Vanishing Point movie was filmed in Cisco, Utah, but in the movie it was portrayed as Cisco, California. This is the location where the film's main character, Kowalski, met his death. Cisco, California is approximately 12 miles west of Claire Tappan Lodge, the Sierra Club identified by former detective Harvey Hines as the location depicted on the Pines card mailed 9 days later after the Los Angeles letter on March the 22nd, 1971, which many believe was hinting at Zodiac's involvement in the disappearance of Donna Lass from the southern tip of Lake Tahoe.
There are two schools of thought to be argued when approaching the communications of the Zodiac Killer as a window to his mind and character. The first is taking the approach that Zodiac was being somewhat truthful, and his propensity to use cryptograms and codes, quote the Mikado, seemingly portray comic books in his artwork, reference movies, and display an animosity toward police should somehow enlighten us to the kind of person we should be looking for. The police adopted this approach after the arrival of the Little List letter on July 26, 1970, as detailed in the San Francisco Chronicle on October 12, 1970, which stated, "A quiet search for one-time Cocos has turned up none that could be Zodiac. Obvious differences in physical description and handwriting comparisons have cleared all Cocos tracked down since the arrival of the July 27 letters." Was a comprehensive search for Cocos by law enforcement exactly what the Zodiac had banked on? Wasting their time chasing down blind alleys and rabbit holes, specifically manufactured by the Zodiac to give police some busy work? In essence, the Zodiac Killer could paint any picture of himself he wanted the reader to swallow, making any identification of a suspect wholly reliant on a killer truthfully representing who he was throughout his communications. This is a very dangerous tactic, when most would agree that the Zodiac was a perennial liar. The second approach to communications is believing that however much the Zodiac Killer tried, some of his character traits and likes would naturally bleed into his correspondence, giving us a window into the mind of the killer. When searching for suspects in the hunt for the Zodiac Killer, we have to consider these two options and tackle the almost impossible task of determining which parts of the communications make up the real Zodiac Killer, or the Zodiac Killer he wanted us to envision. Many believe that the Zodiac Killer had a propensity for the theatrical and had an avid interest in movies, which was none more evident when his 1974 letters arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. Should we be looking for a killer completely opposite to the one he portrayed? Or did the Zodiac openly reveal his interest because he knew that a search for a theatrical movie lover is hardly going to reveal his identity to law enforcement? This we should bear in mind when considering everything that has been showcased in this episode, and leads us to one final example in this presentation.
Edward Theodore Gein, known as the Butcher of Plainfield, was only convicted of the murder of Bernice Worden in November 1957, despite his confession to the murder of Mary Hogan in 1954. The resultant search of his house in Wisconsin would unearth a house of horrors with trophies and keepsakes fashioned from the skin and bones of exhumed bodies from the local graveyards. Authorities found chairs made from human skin, skulls adorned the bedposts, a corset made from a female torso, leggings made from human skin, and a lampshade made from a human face, to name but a few. Ed Gein's descent into madness began after the death of his mother in 1945, igniting a desire within him to create a woman suit from her skin, to effectively become the mother he so cherished. The Ed Gein story would ultimately enter American popular culture and inspire the 1959 novel Psycho by crime author Robert Bloch. The story then hit the big screen on June the 16th, 1960, produced and directed by Alfred Hitchcock, starring Anthony Perkins and Janet Leigh. The Zodiac Killer was not averse to incorporating movies and the macabre into his communications. So what was his inspiration for the composition of the letter and 148 character cipher mailed in 1971? Was it the story of Ed Gein in the newspapers, or the fictionalized novel and movie that drew inspiration from the horrific findings in Plainfield, Wisconsin? Or was it neither? The 1971 letter read, quote, "I'll do it too, because I done it 21 times. I can't stop because each that I kill makes it worse, and I must kill more. Man is the most prized game. I'll never give my name because you don't understand. Next time I will send a patch of human skin if there is some left over." The decoded 148 character cryptogram read, quote, "'Tis the Zodiac speaking. Why can't you stop me? I can't stop killing. Stop listening to phonies. If this is not on your front page in a week, I will skin 3 little kids and make a suit from the skin." This letter was likely mailed in May of 1971, and the Zodiac Killer's response to the arrest and interrogation of Carl Francis Werner, who had been charged with the murders of Kathy Rain Snoozy, aged 15, Deborah Gay Furlong, aged 14, and Kathy Biek, aged 18, in San Jose and Saratoga. 2 of the victims he had already claimed in the Dripping Pen card on November the 8th, 1969, and was determined to keep claim of Snoozy and Furlong as Zodiac victims by arguing that investigators stopped listening to phonies.
This is the Zodiac speaking.
The Zodiac Killer could have written anything in his communications to convince us those were his genuine interests, but could have been sending us on a wild goose chase, meaning the suspects built up through analysing the communications could be way off the mark. We have found connections to Hitchcock, The Most Dangerous Game, The Mikado, Charlie Chan, Batman, The Riddler and Tim Holt. Which of these do you think have no merit? And how do you evaluate which connections are viable interests of the killer or otherwise?
Well, maybe I should start with the one that I think has the most interest to me, would be the Tim Holt comic. That Tahoe 27 was the one that found that. That was really hard to argue that that's not the inspiration for the Halloween card that he wrote, because the words that he used and the design of it is right there on that comic book. So that one to me is one that definitely is an inspiration. But what I would say is that some of the other ones, The Most Dangerous Game, obviously, that seems like a good inspiration. But then you start looking at some of the other ones, the Riddler, for example. We know there was a Zodiac case letter. We don't know if it was actually from the Zodiac. None of us have ever been able to see this letter, but the Riddler mentioned in one of these possible letters. If that's from the real Zodiac, then obviously he was watching Batman and Robin. But if it's not from the real Zodiac and it's just some copycat, it could just be a random person. So to me, that one I think is less convincing, that the Riddler one is an inspiration. But it's clear, no matter which ones are real inspirations, which ones aren't, it's clear that Zodiac was someone who was into the arts, whether that be books or movies or comic book, whatever. He was into that kind of entertainment, and I think that could tell us a little bit about who he was. Even going to something like the Mikado, he's definitely has an interest in the Mikado and Gilbert and Sullivan, it seems like. And so does that mean he's older, or is he a younger person that's listening to older stuff? It's hard to say, but there could be some clues there about who he is.
How can we say for certain he's got an interest in the Mikado and he hasn't just planted it in there to give us the impression he likes the Mikado?
Well, and that's true. He could have, but if so, he went out of his way to present that. Not just a casual mention. He basically, in that one letter, he wrote several pages, including a lot of the Mikado material. And I think throughout several of his letters, you see some inspiration, and that seems like it could be from Gilbert and Sullivan. So, again, no definite way to know, but I think it's a clue that it could be something he's interested in.
And what do you say to a few individuals who claim that there were many death wheels back then and the Tim Holt comic book wasn't necessarily the influence behind the Zodiac's Halloween card?
Well, I would say this, that, you're right. There were some death wheels, but when the words are like in that order, the same word choices, it's kind of hard to not think it's that. And maybe we could say it was based on a death wheel from some comic book, even if not the Tim Holt one, then we still know that it's an inspiration of comic books. Now, me, for example, if I was going to write a letter like Zodiac did and mail it out, I wouldn't know the first thing about comic books. So you wouldn't see me putting something in a letter that's from a comic book, because I know nothing about comic books. I could go out and say, hey, let me throw the police off and go get a comic book and just randomly put stuff in there. But as far as naturally doing it, I don't know the first thing about comic books. So it could just be a clue that he was someone that was into comic books. So, it's worth considering.
I always look at the Lady Doom and the Peekaboo You Are Doomed. And it was red mask, and he put a sort of orangey red mask over the skeleton. These, I think, are too coincidental, and also link into the fact that Zodiac read this particular Tim Holt comic book. I don't know if you think those are good influences as well.
Yeah, and I think if we went through every single letter he made with a fine-tooth comb, with lots of people that know things about comic books and movies, we'd probably find more things that we may have missed. Maybe there's other little hints and clues. I mean, if you look at the Zodiac character in general, he's like a villain from a comic book. His whole persona is a villain, an arch villain from a comic book that he created. The whole costume at Lake Berryessa, it's like something out of a movie where Batman is fighting a villain that has a costume on. So I think it's safe to say that he was drawn to that kind of stuff. And, I'd put my money on him being someone that was into that stuff.
Here's something that may be relevant to your suspect or suspects in general. So, why do you think the Zodiac Killer referenced the Exorcist film, but failed to write about the Zodiac film in 1971 or the Dirty Harry film in the same year? In terms of your suspect, he wasn't incarcerated or indisposed at the time. So why would a suspect such as yours, or somebody else's suspect who was in California at the time, fail to comment on these relevant films when we consider him to be a fully fledged narcissist?
Well, again, I'd be speculating and just be my own theory, but maybe, I think that was shown in limited movie theaters, very few. So maybe him pointing out that movie would give the police some kind of clues that he was there at this specific showing at a specific date. They might be able to narrow down a list. And as it turns out, they were looking at people that were going into that movie theater to see that movie. So, they were looking for people that were out of the ordinary or guys that might match different descriptions or what they thought Zodiac would be like. So it was probably a good idea not to mention that movie and bring that movie up that he had been there. If he was there, maybe he didn't go for whatever reason, who knows? But, you mentioned The Exorcist. That was constantly in news headlines at the time where the Zodiac film wasn't. There weren't people talking about that on the daily news, but they were talking about The Exorcist because it was so shocking and so bizarre and so graphic that it was making news because people were passing out at the theater when they went to see the movie and they were horrified and leaving the theater. So that kind of stuff, getting that kind of attention, that shock value, that's stuff that Zodiac craved, was that shock value. So, why not reference The Exorcist and get some attention from that? That's why I personally think that he did draw some attention to that.
But what about the Dirty Harry film? That would have been box office, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and the Dirty Harry film too. Although at the time, I don't know, and maybe you know the answer, but at the time, I don't think they said, hey, come out and see Dirty Harry. It's based on the Zodiac Killer. I know looking back now, we know that it was based on the Zodiac. But at the time when they were advertising it, maybe they weren't really advertising the Zodiac-like part of the movie. So maybe he didn't go see that movie. Maybe he didn't know it was anything to do with the Zodiac. Who knows?
It wasn't presented as a Zodiac imitation film through the trailer anyway.
Yeah.
But obviously the comparisons since then we can easily see through the bus, the letter, Scorpio, all those things.
Exactly. Exactly. So, at the time when he's figuring out what things to reference, he sees this movie clip, and if they don't really show Zodiac like letters or things that he identifies with, maybe he just skips by it and moves on. And it's also, we talk a little bit about the books, the theater, the music, the things that he may have been interested in. I think one thing many of us can all agree on is that he was a big newspaper reader. So we're looking at someone who's sort of probably, they like to be informed in different ways, whether it's through entertainment or through what's going on in the news. I wouldn't be surprised if this guy had 6 newspapers that he'd go through every morning, just looking for things that were shocking or mentions of his name, whatever. So I think the newspaper part is an important thing too.
Now here's something not so new. I think we've all heard about the film Vanishing Point. In the year 1971, he almost certainly drew inspiration for his Los Angeles letter from the trailer of Vanishing Point, which was released the same day as the Los Angeles letter. That same year in 1971, and this is stuff I've been working on, he mailed the 148 character cipher and letter stating he would skin 3 little kids and make a suit from the skin. The infamous Ed Gein, called the Butcher of Plainfield, skinned his victims and wanted to create a woman suit from his dead mother. This inspired the 1960 film Psycho, something that the Zodiac Killer was often referred to by police. This may well have inspired the Zodiac to want to make a suit from the skin of his victims, which is why he mentioned skinning people and making a suit from the skin in the 148 character cipher. It seemed the Zodiac was an avid follower of films and many have drew parallels to the Zodiac crimes with the Texarkana Moonlight Murders and Jack the Ripper. Do you see any connection to these distant crimes, bearing in mind the Zodiac was prepared to cite the 1924 Richard Connell book called The Most Dangerous Game and The Mikado of 1885? Do you see any connection to the Texarkana Moonlight Murders or Jack the Ripper? Do you see any influence in the Zodiac crimes?
Well, there's definitely some similarities in them.
Have you studied them?
I haven't studied them in detail. I know more probably about the Texarkana Phantom letters than I do the Jack the Ripper ones, for example. But, the Jack the Ripper ones, there was more of a letter writing aspect to it, whereas the Texarkana murders, I don't think there was any kind of letter writing, as my memory serves. But the killings in that case were closer to the Zodiac's killings than Jack the Ripper, I think. But I would say it would be a safe bet that if there were any books out about Jack the Ripper, Zodiac had probably read them. If there were any newspaper articles detailing what was going on in Texarkana, and that made national news, I would bet that Zodiac probably read about that. So I think he was an informed person that drew different inspiration from various things that he read over the years and maybe came back into his mind. One thing we haven't talked about were these dime store crime pulp magazines that were out. They were very popular in the 60s and 70s. And, I think that Zodiac probably read a lot of those. I'd bet money on it. We talked about the Riverside case of Sherry Jo Bates and how some of the writing in that confession letter, and they showed the writing in that magazine. They showed the words with the misspellings before Zodiac used those words and phrases in his letters. So, where I once thought this has to be Zodiac because of this similarity, now I know that they published that before he ever used those words in confirmed Zodiac correspondences. So I wonder if his whole letter writing campaign, the words he used, I wonder if he read about the Sherry Jo Bates case in one of these magazines, became fascinated with it, and then duplicated some of that stuff. Where I used to think it had to be the same person, but now I know that's not the case. It doesn't have to be the same person.
Yeah, in terms of his letters, I used to think that he was deliberately spelling his words incorrectly to try and make himself seem less intelligent. But when we look at things like the button letter, he spells button correctly, and then a few words later spells it incorrectly, and then spells it correctly again. And he does the same with control in the Melvin Belli letter. So do we really believe that he was trying to convince us that he was less intelligent when he couldn't maintain the correct or incorrect spelling through one communication?
Yeah, I'd say it's a good bet that he was probably misspelling words on purpose. Now, maybe there's some experts out there that would say someone has some kind of delirium, some kind of illness, some kind of psychosis, maybe that's a sign that they could spell things right in a moment of clarity, but then sort of go out of clarity and spell something wrong. That's something an expert could probably answer. But I think the safer bet is that he was trying to make himself look like someone who wasn't educated, that didn't know how to spell. And again, that goes back to these dime store magazines. When there'd be anonymous letters, half the time they would say, they were accompanied by a anonymous letter claiming to be from the killer filled with misspellings. So if Zodiac's inspired by that, he says, okay, let me send some letters filled with misspellings. I think it was easily something that he could have read and emulated and did the same thing in his letters. But, at the end of the day, I think he was someone who was educated and he did know how to spell properly.
Or he was trying to paint a picture of somebody who was mentally incapable of sticking to the same spelling. In other words, it was a natural problem he was trying to paint that he had when composing his letters.
Exactly.
Now, let's go back to the little list letter. William Gilbert released Songs of the Savoyard in 1890, containing a list of songs from all Gilbert and Sullivan's operas. Only 6 from the Mikado were featured in this collection, but all 3 of the Zodiacs were featured. The two from the little list was sinister in nature, where the punishment should fit the crime, and I've got a little list where none of them will be missed. But the Exorcist movie letter contained a tame verse about a dicky bird. The Zodiac wrote, "Signed yours truly," followed by the Titwillow verse, leading me to believe it may have been a vague hint towards his name, especially when you look at the actual Mikado Titwillow verse, in which the text read, "I feel just as sure as I'm sure my name isn't Willow, Titwillow, Titwillow." So we have "signed yours truly," and apart from two alphabetical letters, the phrase "my name is present in the Titwillow verse, which he tempted us with in the 13-symbol cipher. So was the X's letter a roundabout way of dropping us a hint to his name, which I know you have been interested in because of Will and Bill being present in that verse? So my question to you would be, do you think the "signed yours truly" was a hint towards his name, knowing that even if he was dropping the hint that his name was William or Bill, that would never lead to his capture?
Yeah, because how many people named William lived in the San Francisco Bay Area in 1969 or whatever? Yeah, so I've tried not to go down that road too much. I think it's safe to say that Zodiac was giving us hints in a lot of his letters, and we just never figured them all out. You know, I think a lot of people have mentioned that name Will or Bill, William being possible names. There was that private investigator whose name escapes me, William
Pennington, was it?
Yes, William Peekaboo Pennington. So there were people saying he was giving us names with that peekaboo, since there was a William Pennington in Vallejo that, used that name. So the name William's been out there for years as a possible thing, and I haven't paid that too much attention to it. It's interesting because my suspect is named William, but I'm not really going down that rabbit hole trying to figure out those names. But you do bring up some good points about just overall him going back repeatedly to those Gilbert and Sullivan things. And to me, that's a worthwhile clue, because if it was just a one-time mention in one letter and he never mentioned it again, that's one thing. But to keep coming back and using these same inspirations, I think that's something that's worth pursuing and looking for suspects that you can identify that might have that verified interest in the Mikado or Gilbert and Sullivan.
We can understand why he picked the verses in the Little List letter on July the 26th, 1970. But to choose that very tame verse in the X's letter suggested to me had an alternative reason for being chosen, because it's a pointless verse, isn't it, for somebody like a serial killer to choose about the suicide of a dicky bird.
Yeah, and again, I go back to Zodiac was trying to give us little hints and little clues that, maybe just went over people's heads. So could it be that he was trying to give us his name and it went over everyone's head back then, investigators? It could be. But, look at other letters. You look at the strange symbol in the Halloween card. That means something. That wasn't, he didn't just design that and just say, I'm just going to put this weird symbol in there. I think it means something to him. And I think that one thing I found recently was some kind of runestone that was the possible scenario. That's what I think it was, because there was a mention of it in the newspapers right around the time he sent that. So I personally think that's what it was. But one way or another, I think he gave us clues in some of the things. In the letter to Paul Avery, he underlined LAV for a reason. He was drawing attention to that. And I don't know what that reason was, but it meant something to him. He tried to give us some kind of clue, and you ask 50 different people, you'll get 50 different reasons why he did that. But I think he was trying to tell us something. We just don't know what it was.
Yeah, we all have different opinions on the Halloween. I've always looked at the Halloween card and thought that he's written 14 three different ways. 14 on the hand, 4-teen, and then I think he just wrote Zodiac 14 combined in that symbol with a 4 alluding to 14 rather than 15, because The same way he separated 4 and teen to tell us he killed 4 teenagers and wrote it in a different fashion, he puts 4 dots to tell us that that's Zodiac 14. So to me, I think it's a more simplistic answer, but I do realize that people have thought it's Mount Diablo, which I don't buy. You've got a different opinion, obviously. So the trouble is there's so many. A lot of people think because that symbol was put on the envelope in the return address position that it may be somehow suggestive of his address. I don't know what your thoughts are on why he wrote that symbol twice.
Yeah, and that, again, it goes back to me thinking this is him telling us something. What it is, I don't know. Where it is, if it's an address, I have no idea. But I think it's a clue of some sort. Maybe I think.
Definitely.
I think he left that clue broad enough that he's given us a clue he is, but not too precise to where it's going to identify him. Because I don't think he really wanted to get caught, but I think he did want to give clues and hints. It goes back to sort of Dave Aranchak telling me that, on the My Name Is cipher, you can't really prove or disprove it because it's too short. Anything that fits in there could be right. There's no way of proving whether it's right or wrong. So this is a scenario like that. 10 different people saying 10 different things that could be right, but there's just no way to prove it.
There are obviously better theories than others. But again, like you said, there's no way you can pin it down 100% because it's practically unsolvable at that length. Unless, of course, you find something in a later communication that drops a hint that you can prove links to it. But again, then you have to prove that link. And so, yeah, I agree with Dave. It's absolutely impossible to prove these things. You can only prove it through argument and reason. And that's not easy.
Yeah, and it'll be interesting if and when the case is solved to go back and sort of fill in the blanks with whoever Zodiac turns out to be and say, okay, now I know why he put this symbol here, or now I know what he meant by this. That's what I'd like to do when and if the case is solved, is go back and see what fits where and if any of the clues then make sense when we have a name and a face to put behind it.
But my guess, if he was alive, which I highly doubt, he would be wheeled in a wheelchair into court. And my guess is he wouldn't reveal any information because if he's anything like the Golden State Killer, we won't get anything out of the guy.
Yeah. And personally, I think he's definitely dead. But
yeah,
it's still, even if he is dead, I'd like to know who it was. And I think the families of his victims deserve to know who it was and be held accountable, even in death. To know that this person did that bad stuff.
And going back to the Tim Holt comic book and the by knife, by gun, by rope and by fire writing, if these were the methods of death or instruments facilitating death, we have 3 used in his 4 canonical attacks. The idea that by fire may have been related to the Kathleen Johns attack or the Dominguez and Edwards murders has been put forth with the burning of the shack or the attempted burning, even though we don't know that was the person responsible for the murders who tried to set fire to that shack in the first place. But at this juncture, he was claiming 14 victims in the Halloween card. So we should be looking for a murder within these claimed victims in the Zodiac timeline subsequent to December 1968. So what I'm basically saying is we've covered this many times before, but what are your thoughts on the by fire attribution? Do you think it should come from these 14 claim victims, whether perceived or otherwise?
Well, to me, it goes back to, again, trying to interpret Zodiac's clues. Now, not everyone will say that 14 represents a victim count necessarily. It may, but at the same time, people like me who suspect's birthday is the 14th, might say he's hinting at his birthday without giving too much away. So I think that's the first thing you have to do is decide what that 14 really means. But it could definitely be some victim count that he's hinting at. And, maybe he's being generic. Maybe there's a death out there someplace that he read about where the person, their car was burned after they were killed or something like that. Who knows? But he may have been hinting at something like that just to try and take credit for different crimes. And one of them may have been burning, or maybe he actually did burn a car someplace, or maybe he ultimately is responsible for Kathleen John's car. You know, I'm highly doubtful that Kathleen Johns was a Zodiac victim myself. There were a lot of bad people doing a lot of bad things back then, and there's no confirmed cases of Zodiac ever abducting anyone and driving them anyplace. So to me, that's not a Zodiac case. But, you know, there's people out there that say it was, so, you know, the debate's going to keep going.
And she wouldn't have been a victim, because it seems like his victims were people he killed, not just people he attacked or abducted anyway.
Exactly.
So,
and every Zodiac killer, we always talk about how the males managed to survive, but they were all attacked in one way or another. Whereas Kathleen, you could call it an attack on her, but he didn't physically grab her or try to strangle her or stab her or anything like that. He basically drove her in his car, according to her. So that doesn't match Zodiac either. You know, when you combine that with Zodiac never having a confirmed victim that he kidnapped or took away from someplace, then to me it just screams that this is not Zodiac.
And a strange crime to claim for such a serious killer.
Yeah, but again, you know, the shock value of the woman and her baby, you know, maybe he says, oh, you know, I already threatened to kill kids on a school bus. What better way than to say that, you know, I abducted this woman and her baby. That's shocking. That'll get some attention for me. So I think that makes sense that he might claim that.
Well, before I ask you this next question, at this current point, where do you stand on the Eureka card?
You know, it's interesting. It's gotten a lot more attention lately. I know Chester Klingle, the suspect connected to Eureka, is someone that has been talked about lately. You know, there's a lot more people, I think, that are open to that being a genuine Zodiac correspondence.
Yeah.
I've always tried to stick with the 1969 to 1974 stuff that's officially verified, and I don't consider anything else officially Zodiac stuff. But
no, not officially, but what do you think? I mean, I wouldn't say the 1990 Eureka card's definitely Zodiac, but if you had to ask me to sway one way or another 60-40, I'd go for it being a Zodiac communication.
I think I'm in the same boat with you, and, you know, again, but I also look at it as, you know, my suspect owned property in that area. So if it is a real Zodiac card, it's a big clue, because it's 200 miles from all known Zodiac stuff, all Zodiac attacks, letter writing, all that kind of stuff. So if you suddenly have a letter out there that's really from Zodiac, you have to say, well, why is Zodiac out there? Does he have some connection to that area? Then you have to start looking at people that have a connection to that area, which, you know, in my case, a suspect owned property there. So to me, that just ticks a box, and you know, but I don't say it's specifically a Zodiac letter, but I'm leaning towards it being legitimate.
Irrespective of whether it was Zodiac or not, though, do you believe there was a theatrical connection to the 1990 Eureka card? We have what many believe to be a card depicting Groucho Marx, who had a connection to Titwillow and Coco, the Lord High Executioner, and a connection to Blatty through the game show You Bet Your Life, in which Blatty won $10,000, which afforded him the ability to write the Exorcist book. Do you accept the Marx connection to the Eureka card? And what do you believe was added to the card by Zodiac, if anything? Because I know Sandy Betts believed the moustache was added to it and something else. Do you believe that card was interfered in any way to make that look like Groucho Marx, or do you believe that was the original card?
I haven't spent enough time researching the card specifically. I'm sure someone out there, you know, whether it's contacting the card manufacturer or something, can find out one way or another if that card came like that. I don't know how much research that would take, but I bet you if you set your mind to it, you could find out if that was truly part of the card. But one way or another, if it represents Groucho Marx, or Zodiac or whoever wrote it changed it to mimic Groucho Marx, that is a clue, because, you know, as you mentioned, Zodiac, in his use of Gilbert and Sullivan stuff, a lot of people theorize that he really had an interest in Groucho Marx, and that the inspiration for the Gilbert Sullivan stuff came because of his interest in Groucho Marx, not because he was interested in Gilbert Sullivan specifically, but he learned about it through Groucho Marx. So you have to wonder if that does represent Groucho Marx. It could very well be a clue that Zodiac really did send that Eureka card. And to me, I go back to, okay, Zodiac may have sent that. Well, my suspect, who I believe was Zodiac, his wife confirmed he was a Groucho Marx fan. So little things like that definitely piqued my interest, but at the end of the day, there's no way to prove what they are, what they aren't, what they represent, or what they don't.
Now, I'm confident that there's been plenty of circumstantial evidence shown to prove the authenticity of the Fairfield letters and the 148-character cipher and letter, but I will accept now that no amount of evidence put forward will change the minds of people who have steadfast beliefs for many years or decades. Now, the Zodiac stated in his 408 cipher, man is the most dangerous animal of all, 3 of the words of which line up with the most dangerous game, which is the short story and film based on the book by Richard Connell. Yet this alone is enough for people to be convinced of the most dangerous game linked to Zodiac, because it's a story that has been cemented into Zodiac folklore for 50 plus years. How confident are you that this link has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt based on just 3 words?
Well, the 3 words, when you have just 3 words sort of connecting, it seems kind of loose, but the overall story of hunting humans, that part does seem to line up with Zodiac. Even the name of the character, Count Zoloff, is Azoroff, is close to Zodiac. The attire he wore when he hunted these people, that seems to match up to Zodiac's choice at Lake Berryessa, for example. So to me, I'd have to, if I had to put money on, I would say for sure that he was referencing and inspired by that book. So again, it could be a clue to who he was and what he read. And, it would be great if we could magically go back to maybe some of the Vallejo libraries and have a master list of who checked out certain books and materials. And if you saw a name that came up over and over again across different books that we think Zodiac used, that would be pretty interesting. Obviously, we can't do that, but that would be a neat project to try and do.
Because there was another film similar to The Most Dangerous Game called A Game of Death in 1945. So there's been plenty of films where humans have been pursued by some sort of crazed killer. So can we really just pinpoint it down to this one film? I don't know, but yeah. Anyway, let's move back to something we haven't spoken about for a while, and that's the Badlands letter from 1974. I'm not convinced it was written by Zodiac, but I'm not totally against the idea that it could have been. But for the purposes of this discussion, let us consider it was authored by Zodiac. In it, the author criticized the running of ads for the Badlands movie. So effectively, the Zodiac would be criticizing the murder glorification of the Badlands movie, when only 3 months earlier he was threatening to kill more people if the Exodus note was not published on the front page of the paper. How can people claim a shift in the mindset of the Zodiac in 1974 with 2 such contradictory communications in just 3 months? In other words, a lot of people think the Zodiac came back in 1974 and was somehow a reformed character, but the Exodus letter doesn't suggest this, with his threat for more mayhem if that note wasn't put in the paper.
And again, I think you see a clash, a contradiction of things going on here. Here he is saying a citizen, he's all concerned that they're showing this violent movie. Again, assuming it's the same person, but just not long ago, he's referencing, doing something, nasty, meaning, killing someone, assuming they're both the same. I believe they both are the same person.
Yes.
So you have to wonder, well, why is that? What's going on? Is there some reason why someone would change? Or, there's that gap between 1971 and 1974 what happened? What was Zodiac doing? Why wasn't he writing? And, I sort of just look at it as, again, you can sort of look and when you have a suspect, you can see things that match up. My suspect getting married in the end of 74, getting engaged in mid 74, taking a job with the state in 1971. He's got these major life changes going on the same time where Zodiac's stopping and starting letter writing. So to me, I see those as possible motivations. So I think it's open to interpretation. You ask any person, you're probably going to get different answers as to why, they did what they did, why Zodiac did what he did, why he wrote things that he did, what inspired him. But at the end of the day, if the 74 letter, Badlands letter, is Zodiac, well, it's just another movie that he's talking about. So again, he's seeing these things on TV, these trailers for movies, these commercials for movies, or he's going to the movies and seeing the actual movies themselves. He's inspired by them. So again, you can go to the SLA letter from 1974. The SLA letter was all over the news. So he's referencing something that he's seeing, that he's taking in. So I think he was a very informed person as to what people were reading about, what they were interested in, what they were talking about, and he's using that to his own benefit. And I think, again, that could be a clue to who he was. Will we ever figure that out based on the clues? I don't know, but I think they may be clues to who he was.
Yeah, the Badlands letter seems more compelling based on the fact that he's featuring a movie within the communication, just like the Exodus letter. I always found it strange that people would claim that the Exodus letter was some sort of epitaph to his impending suicide, when within the same letter he's threatening to kill people in the next breath. It seems rather a bit of a stretch to claim he's committing suicide and then about to go on another rampage. Doesn't seem like the sort of person to me that's just about to top himself.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think it's just for shock value. I think he's again referencing The Exorcist because it was popular, because it was getting headlines, and that's what he wanted, was headlines. So he grabs the stuff that people are talking about. And at the end of the day, just my personal opinion, I think Zodiac, whether he started a new life, whether he went on and got married, whatever happened, I think the things that drove him to kill would still be there, but maybe he found a way to harness that and not act on it in whatever he found that took its place of that stuff. But then again, if he really left that character behind and moved on and started a new life, then why would he write the 1990 letters and stuff if he really was the one that wrote that letter? Why would he later on write some of these other possible letters if they were really from Zodiac, the 78 letters and stuff like that? Any of the letters that came afterwards, if any of those really were from Zodiac, then I think it proves that he really didn't leave that part of him behind, that he still liked to needle the cops, just maybe not kill people, but still wanted to play cat and mouse games with them.
And if he changed his life in the future and became a different person, he may have changed his way of murdering.
Yeah, and that's the rabbit hole you go down, is because then you start saying, well, what about this murder? What about that murder? And I think that's what Zodiac sort of wanted. He wanted people to wonder and bring up his name. Is this Zodiac? Could the Zodiac have done this? Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now, so you don't miss a single episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackiller.net.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. As we wrap up this episode, Rich and I would like to play a preview of a true crime podcast we think you'll like. It's called Reverie True Crime. Be sure to give it a listen. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.
Reverie, the state of being pleasantly lost in one's thoughts. A daydream. But what if those daydreams turn to nightmares? Reverie True Crime shines a light on the dark tragedies that have happened and are continuing to happen all throughout the world. We interview and work with families to bring awareness to forms of injustice. We explore the depths of cases from around the world to include missing persons, mysteries, and more. Reverie True Crime is found wherever you're listening to this podcast. Remember, you don't have to live in fear, but stay aware of your surroundings. Stay safe and take care.